Hello and welcome to this presentation about the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance Early Career Fellowship Programme. My name is Fiona Watt. I work at King's College London and I chair the committee that assesses the applications. The purpose of this presentation is to explain the scheme to you and also to answer some of the frequently asked questions about the scheme. So who are these fellowships designed for? Well, they're designed for people who are in the last year of their PhD or who got their PhD less than 4 years ago. It's important to stress that these fellowships are designed for anybody who would like to carry out their research in India. There's no need to be an Indian national to be eligible. What does the fellowship scheme provide? Well, it provides your full-time salary for 5 years. It provides a budget for the consumables or reagents that you will need in the lab, including the costs of animals if you need them for your research. It will also pay for small items of equipment, although we expect that your host institution will have the major items of equipment that you are going to need for your research. Additional allowances are a generous travel budget which will enable you to spend time in labs overseas to carry out collaborative research. Although the fellowship is primarily designed to fund you as an individual, there is a provision which will allow you to hire a research technician if it's appropriate for the research that you want to carry out. So it's a really good package and one that is certainly internationally competitive. So obviously the first step in writing a proposal is to have an idea of what it is you want to work on. Then after that you need to find a suitable host institution. That isn't as simple as you might think, because you need to find an environment where you will have the colleagues that you will feel comfortable working with. You need to make sure that the institution has the facilities that you need for your work. And you need to make sure that this is an environment which will support you and provide mentorship while at the same time providing a place where you can grow into full independence. So my advice is don't rush into committing to any particular institution until you've had a chance to visit it and establish how much interest the host institution will have in supporting you. It's really important to make sure that when you write the proposal in earnest, you are a good match for the place that you want to be. Another piece of advice I would give is to pay attention to the structure. The number of objectives you can have in your proposal is not specified, but typically people will say that they have 3 main objectives. Again, classically, the first objective will be something that you can easily do because it's straightforward. It might be an extension of your expertise. And then as you move through the second and third objectives, what you're proposing will become more ambitious, more high risk. It's a very bad idea to say in an early career fellowship proposal that you're essentially going to carry on the entire research proposal of your current lab, which may have 20 people in it. We want to know that you've thought realistically about what you can achieve, that it's going to be something that is within your competence, that is a good match for your host institution, and that of course things don't always work out as you had planned, but that you have a fallback position if something doesn't work. My next piece of advice is that you should allow plenty of time to write the proposal. The number of times that people that I work with, my colleagues, come rushing to me at the last minute and say, could you take a look at this grant? The deadline is tomorrow. You're not going to get good advice if you leave it too late to write the proposal. And also, in my experience, ideas for research take time to grow. You want to test out your ideas with your sponsor and supervisor. You want to knock the ideas around with your colleagues. And you definitely want to make sure that a good draft of your proposal is read by not just one person, but by several people. With my own grants, I choose at least 2 or 3 colleagues, and I always like to pick somebody to read my proposal who has absolutely no specialist knowledge of what I'm writing about. So you shouldn't be shy about seeking advice. It's really important for writing the strongest proposal, but you must allow plenty of time. And although you'll be thinking about the proposal itself, you have to remember that you have to allow time for the other bits of the application. You need to give your sponsor and your referees enough time to write really strong letters, and the budget itself needs time to be worked out. Because although overall there's a certain envelope of funding, you need to be able to justify it. And if you put in outrageous requests for things that you don't refer to at all in the grant application, that is going to be a red flag to the people who are assessing the proposal. There are a couple of other points I'd like to make about writing the proposal. And one which is very important is to make sure that you couch it in a way that a non-specialist will understand. So by that I mean you shouldn't assume that everybody who reads your proposal is an expert in the minutiae of the experiments. You need to lead readers into the proposal. Why do I want to do this? Why is it interesting? Is this a health problem that is important in India specifically, or is it a problem that is generic? Is it fundamental discovery science? You have to think about talking to somebody that you first meet, for example. You wouldn't launch straight into the details of the experiment you did yesterday. You would say, I am a cell biologist, I'm interested in skin, something like that. It doesn't use a lot of the word count, but it really helps the reviewer to understand what you're trying to do. You also have to remember that we read a lot of applications, and if you lose your reader in the first paragraph, it's much harder to regain them further several thousand words down the line. So be kind to your reviewer, explain why you want to do this, why it's interesting, and that will get you off to a great start. So I'll now go through some of the questions that are frequently asked by applicants. So one of the frequently asked questions is how to make most effective use of the word limit, because we take the word limit very seriously and we will not review proposals that are much longer than the requested limit. So I've said already that you must give an effective introduction and lead the reader into the proposal. You need to explain the specific objectives, and you need to give enough detail that we understand what particular experimental approaches you're going to use. For example, if you're proposing to do single-cell RNA-seq, we don't need a long essay on the procedure, but we would like an indication of which of the different methodologies you plan to use. If it's a technique that you haven't learned, that you don't know, you might, for example, say, I'm going to use this technique and I will go to such and such a lab to receive training. So it's really about, in a concise way, leading the reader through what you want to do, why it's interesting, and the time frame in which you're going to achieve it. Something that might not seem important to you but is important is to reference work appropriately. It's a really bad idea to fail to cite somebody who's a potential competitor in the hope that the reviewer won't notice it. If somebody is working in your area, you should definitely cite that. Now, I know that you're going to be short of words, but I would avoid citing reviews except in the introduction, and try to just pick a few key up-to-date primary articles to support your argument. It's surprisingly often that we see, we read applications where the most recent papers cited were 3 or 4 years ago, and that doesn't really seem right if you're on top of the field. So those would be my pieces of advice about selling your story but keeping to the word limit. One of the frequently asked questions is, how do you ensure that your proposal is neither overambitious nor underambitious? Again, I touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation where I said that typically you will break down the proposal into 3 or 4 specific objectives, one which is easily attainable and then growing in ambition. But I think at this point, and it's very hard at this early stage in your career, but you should sit down and say, well, realistically, how long is it going to take me to do this piece of work? It's a good idea to produce a Gantt chart or a sort of timeline and think to yourself, well, will I be able to do that in this time? And if you really put yourself in the mindset of being the researcher carrying out the work rather than the person writing the proposal, I think that will be a really good guide to hitting the level of ambition that we're looking for. Another issue that applicants are worried about is preliminary data. Do you need preliminary data? And if so, how much? The thing is that if you are at the junior end of the scheme where you're just finishing your PhD and you're going to move to a different lab, perhaps a different country for this fellowship, it's unrealistic to expect that you would have generated a lot of preliminary data. On the other hand, if you want to pursue an idea that you've already begun, you might want to include 1 or 2 figures on that. And it could be that your host institution has some unpublished data that would support your proposal. So I would say, to summarize, we don't expect a lot of preliminary data. But if you have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 figures which you think would really help convince us that this proposal is going to fly, then by all means include it. One topic which has become very prominent throughout the world is the issue of power calculations and applying appropriate statistical tests to your data. Now, back in the bad old days, people would do experiments 3 times, show standard error of the mean or standard deviation, whichever looked smaller, do a p-test and sprinkle a few asterisks over the histogram. This type of approach has probably led to a lot of flawed conclusions over the years. And I'm pleased to say that nowadays the funding bodies and the journals who publish science are taking a close look at whether you are statistically powered to achieve what you want to do. My piece of advice with this would be, make sure that if you don't actually have the statistical knowledge to do these calculations yourself, you seek out somewhere in your institution who can help you. They may not be an expert in the specific experiments you want to do, but a good statistician, if you explain simply what the sample sizes are, what the level of variation expected in, can really make you produce a good proposal. And if you can say, I plan to do this experiment with a group of 10 mice, for example, and my power calculation is that this number of mice is sufficient to give me the results I'm expecting, then that is really a strong basis for proceeding with the proposed experiments. For many of you writing one of these fellowships, it'll be your first experience of producing a scientific budget. I am no financial expert, but when I write a grant, I find out what the level of funding is going to be, and then I calculate my plans accordingly. So for an early career fellowship, you need to budget your salary, and then you need to think, what is it I want to do? If you want to budget for a research technician, you need to work out the salary for that person. And then you need to say, what do I need? Is it a wet lab project in which I need a lot of antibodies or chemicals? Is it a project which requires a lot of computational power, in which case have I budgeted properly for compute time and storage? And it could be that you need access to core facilities. It might be a flow cytometry core, it might be a genomics core. You need to work out what the access charges are for that. So you'll find very quickly a sum of money, which seems quite a lot, gets rapidly spent on paper. And if the budget looks a bit wrong to you, if you don't think you have enough money for what you want to do, I would recommend going back to the written proposal and perhaps saying, is this too ambitious? Is there some aspect of the proposal that I should get rid of? So those would be the sort of high-level ways of planning your budget. You'll see that in the application we require a number of letters of support. We read these very carefully, and what we're looking for are support letters from people who've really thought about you and the environment in which you're going to work. We don't want a generic letter which would work for anybody. We want to know that your supervisor and the host institution have thought about you. We want to know maybe whether there are extra things that they would make available to you. For example, it might be that they realise that for your needs they're going to need a new confocal microscope. You can't put that in the budget, but if they say, we have identified this funding stream to buy this equipment for this person. If your project involves a lot of genetically modified mice, it's a very good idea if the support letter says, we have these superb animal facilities which will meet your needs. So in getting a good support letter, it's very important, obviously, that you've spoken to the person writing the letter so that they understand what it is you're doing. They should, of course, say flattering things about you so that we know that they know who you are. And really, the letter should show real enthusiasm for supporting you at this critical phase in your career. The final question, which is often asked, and in a way is quite hard to answer, is what are the most common strengths and weaknesses of the research proposals? I suppose one weakness, which I've already alluded to, is that you assume too much expert knowledge from the first sentence of the proposal, leaving your reviewers scrabbling to try and understand what you're doing. Sometimes there's a lot of space wasted in kind of highfalutin, flamboyant language about how you loved collecting butterflies when you were a child, and that's why a fellowship is the next step for you. You need to step back from that and remember every word counts. We like sentences to be properly constructed. If the grammar is poor, if you haven't run a spell check, that is a bad sign. And something for me personally is that I like the text divided into reasonable paragraphs. A 3-page stream of consciousness with no paragraph breaks is really tiring to read. You might find, for example, if you have a friend or partner who's not a scientist, you could ask them to have a look at it and see if they can spot grammatical errors, things that you wouldn't have seen. But it's all about making it clear and readable and enjoyable, so that at the end of reading your proposal, we understand what it is you're about. So that's it from me. Remember that the Alliance officers are always happy to field your questions, and the Alliance website is also a mine of information. So with that, I'll just say good luck, and I look forward to meeting you at the interview.